Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be able to come and speak about subjects that I'm closely involved in and enjoy very much, spend all my time kind of involved with. So I come to this really from the perspective of a historian. I was trained in history, but I've increasingly ended up collaborating with climate scientists and historical climatologists. The talk that I'm going to give today reflects this work. So the first part, I want to profile one of the projects that Heli mentioned, which some of you I know are very familiar with already, the ACRE project. And so apologies to some of you who have already heard presentations about ACRE. I'll try not to bore you too much. Now, ACRE was originally a science project, and the work that has been done under ACRE to recover some of the long instrumental weather records for China was one of the things that I was asked to talk about today. So the work that ACRE does for China and Southeast Asia. But then I wanted to move on to profile some of the work that I've been doing, partly using the data that ACRE has been helping to facilitate, as well as with my historian's hat on to try and think a bit more broadly about some of the social impacts of that weather as well. So I'm going to be profiling several different projects. So first of all, I probably ought to, for those of you who don't know ACRE already, I should probably start with a brief introduction to what ACRE is. The Atmospheric Circulation Reconstructions over the Earth initiative. It took me actually quite a long time to remember that. And it really is the baby of Professor Rob Allen, who works at the Hadley Centre at the UK Meteorological Office. And it's essentially been, in many respects, a one-man drive to kind of promote this project on a global level. Essentially, Rob realised that there was both paucity of data, long instrumental record data for particular parts of the world, Asia being one of them. Not that the data doesn't exist, but it hadn't been recovered in a usable format. And so this was kind of his dreams to start this project with a very, very simple aim to recover data by doing historical archival research, and then to get it imaged, and then to get it digitized. 3 stages, extremely simple. Essentially, it's grown an awful lot since then. I mean, literally in scope globally. Stefan in the audience is responsible for the South Africa element of ACRE. I'm responsible for the ACRE Southeast Asia part. We have ACRE China. We have even ACRE Antarctica. So it really has kind of expanded massively. It's kind of process of global domination. The other thing, apart from these kind of 3 simple aims of kind of researching and digitizing the data, what Rob has also been trying to do is to act as an umbrella to bring in other data recovery projects or people involved in data recovery to try and link our efforts and I suppose create a big network of people who all have similar aims. One of the crucial things that I just want to highlight is the fact that anyone who gets involved with ACRE also has to kind of undertake a kind of a promise that any data that is recovered will actually be made publicly accessible and freely available, and that is part of the beauty of this. It makes it problematic sometimes, especially working in Southeast Asia, where national meteorological agencies do not want their data to be made public or to be made free. So that's another political issue that we've ended up getting involved in, but that's something else. And the last thing I want to mention before I move on is that essentially it's a grassroots initiative. Although Rob spearheads it, it's essentially through a bunch of people like myself, like Stefan, who are just really genuinely interested and see the value of this kind of work and devote our own time and a lot of our own research to actually recovering a lot of this work for the greater good. This is just a sense of the kinds of organisations and institutions that are now actually sponsoring or supporting ACRE in some way, be it financial or non-financial. So it kind of just gives you a sense of, how much notoriety as it were, that the project now has. A lot of the information that is recovered is actually going to partner organisations as well, particularly at NOAA, to be used within reanalyses of particular either long-term weather or the recreation of particular events as well. A lot of the data that ACRE has been recovering is actually being fed into the new, or the old and also the new versions of the 20CR. This is not my area, but I just wanted to kind of highlight the fact that the 20CR has been kind of improved by a lot of the data that ACRE and others are facilitating through this. And I just want to give you a quick example of how this works. This is for England, of course, so it's not an Asian example. But just to note, this is the 20CR with version 3 on the right, and you can see that it's much clearer, the assimilation is much more precise, much less uncertainty with the additional 43 new station observations that have been added in. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that although ACRE is a global initiative, we also really focus on some of the areas where there's a lot less information, there's a paucity of information. And the other thing that we specialise in as well is marine data. I think the Clywalk project was mentioned earlier as well, and some of the people who actually worked on that original Clywalk project have actually come into the ACRE fold as well. They were kind of linked projects. And so one of the things that we've been doing, we started off doing a lot of work on, is ship logbooks, because they have such a wealth of evidence from, say, the VOC or the English East India Company, Royal Navy, Merchant Navy. I mean, there's just so much out there. It's literally kind of a lifetime's work just to kind of go actually access a lot of this ship data. But the beauty as well of the ship data is that it's not just entirely marine, but for a lot of the port cities that I've been looking at, the ships also went into port. They may be docked in port for a few weeks, a few months, but they continue to take observations whilst on board ship. And some of the smaller ships also went up some of the inland rivers as well. So you also get kind of a terrestrial, semi-terrestrial coverage from some of those ship logs as well. Okay, so just to move on to ACRE China and ACRE Southeast Asia. Right, so ACRE China is basically headed by a collaborative partnership between different Chinese organisations, including the Beijing Climate Centre, the China University of Geosciences, and the CMA, the China Meteorological Administration, with the UK Meteorological Office, under the Climate Service Science for Service Partnership China, sponsored by the Newton Fund. And ACRE has been directly benefiting from this very vast project, which has had a lot of money over the last 3 to 4 years, to actually fund more data recovery activities for China and Southeast Asia. And that's essentially how our kind of grassroots volunteer project has been able to keep afloat, because we've been getting funding indirectly through the Newton Fund. And this is quite amazing what CUG and CMA have actually done so far. So for mainland China, under the ACRE China effort, they've been actually able to have got sub-daily data for 19 stations for mainland China. And this ultimately results in about 3.3 million pages. And this is all headed, ACRE China is headed by Guoyu Ren, who's at the China University of Geosciences, CUG. This is just an example, courtesy of Professor Ren, of some of the data sets that they've been able to recover, and the 19 stations. Some of them, as you can see, are extremely early, and for not just the obvious cities either. Obviously the big cities, but not just the obvious kind of Beijing and Shanghai, but some of the smaller regional centres as well. Some of them go back quite early. There's 1887, 1880 for Wuhan, which is a very consistent record there, 1868 for Beijing. So all this is now in the process, partly been digitised, and that which has been digitised is the pressure observations have already been sent to the ISPD. So this is fantastic work. Along the way, we've also found some other bits as well, and this is what some of the historians like myself involved in the project have also been doing as well. I've spent quite a lot of time in the Royal Society Archive in London, And we've been finding bits and pieces, nothing really long or consistent, but bits and pieces. So things like for Canton for the 1770s, 1804, 1836, and then some of the ship's logs as well. A lot of these are from ships in port, actually, that were stationed in these areas at that time. And then some other kind of very famous voyages or missionaries who were in China as well. So between ACRE and between CUG, we've been getting all these small sets of information digitized too. The other element I did just want to mention for China is that's the maritime customs stations, an absolutely brilliant repository of terrestrial and riverine observations for not just China, but the entire China coast, and sometimes even stretching as far as Japan as well. It was a massive network, and this was a collaboration with the University of Bristol, Robert Bickers, who got a catalogue together of all the information that was in the China Coast Meteorological Register, and it was digitized under ACRE. So this is now all available. And that's just an image of the customs stations, very handily found in an old book. And that just gives you a sense of the extent of where those meteorological registering stations were. Some of them actually quite far inland, so stretching all the way across the China coast, and also including Taiwan and Hong Kong as well. Some other random bits and pieces as well. One thing I do just want to mention from here is we've also been collaborating with some ACRE Japan, which is our new initiative that launched last year in Tokyo. And so we've been working with JAMSTEC and TMU and the University of Tokyo and the University of Kobe. And one of the reasons why I've been so interested in working with some of the Japanese scholars is because essentially of the Second World War. There's massive data gaps for the 1930s and 1940s in Asia, but it's partly to do with the Japanese imperial period and then the Second World War, where the Japanese had their imperial network which spread out across Southeast Asia, and they have a lot of observations for that period of time which then got taken back to Japan and are actually now stored in Japanese archives. So they actually cover a really huge period of at least kind of 10 years. So we're now kind of working on recovering some of those data as well. Okay, just briefly Hong Kong, because this is what I've been working on with the Hong Kong Observatory. These are records that we've highlighted that are currently available. They're mainly in government gazettes, which very handily have been made available by Hong Kong University Digitization Program, imaging. The images have been made available. So now over the next 2 years, under one of the projects that I've now got funded, we're going to get all these digitized as well. So this is a really long record for Hong Kong, going back to 1853. And most of the later ones, they're continuous and sub-daily observations as well. Okay, ACRE Southeast Asia. So this is, I guess, what I've really been working on the most over the last few years. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, I don't know how good your Southeast Asian history is, but essentially the British went to Malaysia and Singapore in Penang from 1786. They then took control of Malacca, and they then took control of Singapore, or what was there prior to the urban centres that are there today. So Singapore is 1819. And from the moment they arrived on Malaysian or Singaporean shores, they were taking observations. Firstly under the East India Company, because they wanted to investigate what the climate was, whether it was going to be good for growing, whether it was going to be good to have a deep harbour there, whether it was going to be a good place to actually settle. And one of the things they really actually liked, sadly perhaps for Malaysia and Singapore, the climate was actually a crucial factor in them making a decision to actually stay, because they felt it had a very equitable climate and it was going to be good for trade and for shipping. So right from the very beginning, I want to talk a bit more about Singapore, because Singapore has perhaps the most consistent and longest set of records. Although they were in Penang earlier from 1786, Singapore is essentially the administrative capital from about 1824. So it was the biggest urban centre, and this means that there was the most money there, and they also had subsequently the most registering stations there too. So Singapore has really been my focus, although I have been working more as well on Peninsular Malaysia too. What we've got so far is from 1820s onwards. The very early stuff is a little bit scattered. A lot of it I've actually found in journals, things like the Royal Asiatic journals, which were published contemporaneously. And it's a bit erratic because essentially it's things like what we see on the right-hand side here. They've shown that they're taking the observations at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m, but what they've done is they've given you an average for the whole month, which is really annoying. But the fact is that we know that they were taking these observations, we know what they were doing and where. So it's now a question of trying to piece together, do the originals exist, so that we can actually, pull out the original daily, sub-daily observations. So the 1820s have been a little bit weird. We've got kind of monthly averages, but I'm trying to highlight where the originals may have gone if they're still around. But from the 1830s, everything gets very nice. Stuff gets started to be published in the newspapers from the 1830s, so we've got a continuous data set from about 1833 right through to 1845. The great thing about 1841 to 1845 is that there was actually an observatory in Singapore as well. And unusually, the British were very good at putting observatories around Asia. They spent a lot of money on it in the 1840s under the big magnetic campaign. They would set up observatories in India, in Canada, in Australia. And they also did one for Singapore as well. But it was a little bit, compared to some of the other ones, it wasn't as good. It was a bit makeshift. It was made from kind of local materials, at-up roof, wooden walls. It wasn't really designed to last like some of the ones that the British built in India. And throughout the 4 years of its existence, the person who was in charge of it, Captain Elliot, he was continually writing to the British government in London, basically pleading for more money. He wants to have more staff, he wants to be able to continue beyond 1845. But unfortunately, in 1845, the British government, for some reason, cost-cutting, says, no, sorry, it's done. So really unfortunately, at that point in time, these amazing sub-daily records that we have a fantastic record of, which are all in the Royal Society in London, it just disappears. There's nothing else after this. There's a massive gap until 1861, and I still cannot put, I've been looking at this for 3 years, and I still cannot put my finger on what happened to the data between 1845 and 1861. There's just nothing. And I know that it was still being taken, but it's just, where is it? It's not being published in the newspapers, it's not in the government gazettes. Where has it gone? I don't know. If anyone knows, please write to me. After 1861, things get better again. The number of registering stations improves, and people start getting much more interested in climate, and it gets published in the gazettes and it gets published in newspapers. But generally speaking, the scientific narrative picks up as well. People are starting to get more interested in something I mentioned earlier, which was the desiccation debate. People were starting to look at the environmental erosion in Singapore and in Malaysia and kind of going, hold on a second, are we doing something here? And is what we're doing to the environment affecting the climate? So they got more interested into making observations. So things really pick up, and then, so I've been getting a record together which goes basically through until at the moment about 1925, and I plan to extend that as far as I can. Definitely till 1929, which is when the Meteorological Service, the official Malaysian Meteorological Service starts. Because this is the period where it's all slightly more patchy. Because between 1845 and the end of the observatory and 1929, when the Malaysian Meteorological Service is opened, there is no meteorological service. It's just being taken by ordinary people, plantation owners, doctors, hospitals. So the record is quite patchy. The other thing that I've been doing some work on as well is also actually getting the locations correct as well for where the observation stations were. Just to give you an example, on here you've got the records for the convict jail hospital from the 1870s, and it gives you a generic latitude and longitude. And I've realised that all the records for Singapore have the same latitude and longitude, regardless of where the registering station was. And that has now been filtered through to some of the major databases, global databases for Singapore. So it's always this latitude and longitude. But if you actually look up the latitude and longitude, it's somewhere out in the sea. So that's something that I've been trying to work on, because it's quite important, because this is going into, you know, the actual scientific databases that people are using. And the meteorological services of Singapore were also very interested in this as well, because they want to look at things like urban heat. They can't do that if they don't actually know where the registering stations were. So as a historian, I've been trying to use some of the old maps and actually putting together where some of the registering stations were. So this is the work that I've been doing here. I will just very briefly mention where some of this work is also going to as well. As I said, well, I'm a historian and I've been collecting this data on behalf of ACRE, so I guess I may as well do something with it myself as well. So 2 projects that I've just got funding for. This one literally just started last month, so nothing's really happened. El Nino of 1877 to 8 in Malaysia and Singapore. As far as I'm aware, no one's done any historical work on this at all. And there's been a lot of historical work done, say, on India and other parts of the world, but not on Malaysia and Singapore. So I've been trying to look at this, and obviously through I realised that something was going on because I've been looking at the data for that year, and it's obviously a very low rainfall year. There was lots of newspaper records for drought, it being a particularly severe drought as well, and it happened to coincide with just before the main reservoir for Singapore had been opened. So it was quite a serious impact on Singapore, and particularly for rural parts as well. And there's a particular story going on as well. And it alludes back to a discussion I was having earlier actually about drought. And if you listen to the governmental records, well, you know, there was a bit of, you know, lack of rain, nothing really happened. But if you look at some of the newspaper reports, it seemed like in some of the rural areas, people, you know, there was a newspaper report that actually said that people were dropping off like flies because they had really poor quality water or not enough water to drink. The rates of cholera had got really high, but the government were covering it up. Essentially, they were not reporting on what was going on, and they weren't really interested in what was going on in the rural villages. So this is a story that I'm hoping to uncover. The second and the last project that I just want to mention is the one on urban heat. And I've been noticing that whilst looking at Singapore and Hong Kong, both the meteorological agencies for both these countries were very interested in this, because they don't, the Singapore Meteorological Service, for example, does not actually take the difference between the kind of the urban and rural divide into their current reconstructions for Singapore. So they're very interested in looking at kind of those stations that once were rural and now are urban, to try and look at how things have changed. This is a project we've just got funded for the next 3 years, and it's going to be a kind of a collaboration between sociologists, climate scientists and historians and also some disaster experts as well, to think about the impacts of urban heat. So we're looking at actually getting the records to contrast between urban and rural sites to see what the temperature differences actually were, but then also thinking about how people dealt with heat in the past and moving into the future as well. And our target cities are Hong Kong, Singapore, New Delhi and Wuhan. Thank you very much.